Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing House. This film came out in 1977. It was directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi. This is a Japanese film that is a sort of surrealist horror comedy that has gained a lot of cult status over time. I personally wasn't really aware of it until it was released as, with the Criterion Collection. I was 20 years old or something, but I was really just struck by the artwork and just wondering what could this possibly be. I watched it at the time, and you know that I'm huge into like surrealist horror films and like real trippy kinds of stuff. That's my specialty, right? But even for me, this film was unlike anything I have ever seen in my life, and that is really saying something. It makes you feel things that you're not used to. Just from a sensory point of view, it's very, very jarring tonally. It blends all of these emotional extremes, particularly between major fear and major humor, to such a degree that it begins to push through into areas of the mind that maybe you're not so used to inhabiting, maybe you're not so used to exploring. It's pushing your ability to be able to experience things and how you experience them. And for me, this movie, it's a really tough one to describe just because of how truly eccentric it is. It is so boundless and full of imagination and strangeness. It feels like a Japanese manga that has been splintered like glass into all of these different fragments, and now it's like reworked so that it's like a kaleidoscope. It's like a mix of colors that are like reigniting and creating something new and original and special. It made me think of Juju a lot. I mean, if you're a fan of that band, they're real eccentric. I'm a big fan of theirs, but this is like if a Juju album were a film in a lot of ways. Like Ouran High School Host Club on acid, or something to that effect. With shades of maybe Dario Argento, but to a much greater degree. I mean, it's a lot stranger, I should say. There is a similar aesthetic, especially when you look at just like the color of all the backgrounds. And there is an artificiality to it. And that was really the intent with this movie, was to make it look kind of cheap and kind of slapped together, not realistic. It's especially ambitious, and the cheapness of it makes it feel almost like it is a different world. That sort of Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass sort of quality. Through the eyes of somebody who is maybe innocent, which for me is why it is so effective as a work, because it has this gleeful, childlike abandonment to it, where the fantasy elements are just absolutely boundless. It reminded me even of like Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away, just because it seems to have this great respect for the childlike point of view. Obayashi wanted that perspective, and Miyazaki also wanted that perspective, and they treat it with respect, which for me is really important. I agree with Obayashi and what he said about adults, that adults are just really boring. They don't seem to think about anything beyond what they can understand, what is realistic to them on just a basic human level. And kids, they don't have that for the most part. They are unfiltered. They don't have expectations. For me, I find children most of the time infinitely more interesting than the adults. And maybe that's why the film appeals to me the way that it does. The imagery, the horror, it is like full on LSD experience where all of the expectations just completely dissolve and the imagination becomes so overwhelmingly powerful and, impulsive to the extreme. And the imagery is so unforgettable in this movie because it is, as I said, it is so unique. It's so original. I hadn't seen this movie in 10 years, but of course I couldn't forget that image of the girl playing the piano and then the piano swallowing her and only her fingers are left playing the melody. And Obayashi got a lot of these ideas from his daughter, who was quite young at the time, because again, he wanted that fresh perspective, that feeling, that boundless imagination. And there is that sort of eccentric, sort of terrifying humor, and it feels like a child's nightmare where it's constantly shifting between really brutal and really grotesque. And, it is kind of this, like a storybook, kind of a surreal phantasmagoria, but also it's got all of this screwball humor in it. And it is a simple trope that we've seen many times. It's just like the typical haunted house story, but again, filtered like through a weird psychedelic storybook, which brings a freshness to it, breathing life into a genre that continues to reinvent itself visually, I think, because of films like this. Especially at the time when people were just experimenting more, Eurotrash horror, grindhouse horror, and how that horror can be paleted, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s. Just the attention to detail, the transitions between scenes, the reflections, the colors, the kind of goofy, like sort of cutesiness that is just sliced into, pun intended, with this like real like darkness. And as Obayashi has expressed in the past, he really wanted to bring a lot of his own visions and his own childhood memories to the film so that it felt even more original, more personal. And this does include, you know, the atomic bombings during World War II that he remembered as a child in Japan, and this is incorporated into the story, of course, but more as a backstory. The idea of this old woman being a relic of a dark past, a relic of a darker time in history, and that bitterness behind that and the heartbreak and the loneliness and the anger perhaps has just built over time until your sense of self and your perceptions of the world are so distorted that there's really no split between fantasy and reality anymore. And the old woman is this very haunting presence, a very elegant presence in the film, and she's, of course, spooking her granddaughter and her high school friends. They come to stay with her during their summer vacation. By doing this, she's clinging to the romanticism of youth. And that's what I see the film as. It's told, you know, through the eyes of the young girls. So it is a coming of age story. It's just about a girl going to visit her grandmother. She does it as an act of resentment because she finds out that her father is getting remarried after her mother died years and years ago. So at the beginning of the movie, she's feeling that twinge, that loss of innocence very early on, and this will plunge her kind of deeper into a big journey of examination. I think a lot of the film really reflects the generational divide and how these young girls, these high school girls, you know, they perhaps don't have the same appreciation for things that the older generation did. You know, they don't have the same tragic experiences to draw upon. Values have changed a lot. The idea of masculinity has changed a lot. You know, they mention masculinity quite a lot in the movie because, again, these are young girls, and so, you know, they talk about World War II and, oh, how men were so manly back then, much more manly than now. And the house really represents, you know, these young girls coming to terms with their budding womanhood. The ghosts of the past breathing maybe a darker life into them. And you feel a sense of body horror in the movie, not overtly or anything like that, but just kind of hints of them. And we often do associate that with puberty and adolescence. There is kind of a sense of sexuality kind of brewing underneath everything, and perhaps like, you know, a sexual awakening symbolically through the imagery. But in the end, you know, the old generation, the new generation, bitterness, jealousy towards time, or tragedy can be linked, you know, no matter what age. This is maybe one of my favorite Japanese horror films, which is really saying something because they do it very, very well and have proven so time and time again. This one feels very grounded, and yet in the same way it doesn't. You know, it blends a lot of classical traditional film elements with a lot of really unique things that maybe people have never seen before. Having that foundation allows you to be able to twist it and embellish it in interesting ways. Especially in the third act, things get crazy. It's like a full-on, you know, LSD peak. And once all of that is over, it feels almost like, you know, you've been through all this stuff in your mind, so you hit a sort of zen sweet spot where all the fluctuating emotions that are being pulled in every direction within your mind, suddenly it becomes natural. It's like all of that can just roam freely in your mind, and suddenly it all makes sense. Again, it's one of the most visually striking movies I've ever seen. It's one of the most original movies I've ever seen. It does harken back to like a lot of the imagery you might see in Japanese kind of paranormal folk tales, and maybe like kabuki theater and Alice in Wonderland, all like infused to the absolute maximum. It's just so lively. It has this excitement to it, this energy that just pops, and I just wish more movies were like this. Please check it out, whether you love it or hate it. Every time I recommend this movie, I have no idea how people are going to receive it, but at least it will be an experience that you likely will never forget. And that's my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I talked last week about a website that I developed, so you can see the link there. I'm, you know, offering commissioned portrait work. I'm an artist, and I have prints available as well. Going to be working on doing some photography prints as well. As always, thank you so much to the Patreon supporters. You can see them there, and the link to support that is below, and all the social media below that. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you want to. Catch you next time.